Today I feel like partaking in Hegelian dialectics. We're going to have a discussion about some things that you would sit and talk about with your friends inside your living room. Who is the best 155-pound champion between Khabib and Islam Makhachev? And we are talking about what each fighter accomplished in the lightweight division as champion. Islam Makhachev has a prospect to go up to 170 and challenge Jack Della Maddalena for another belt. If he ends up doing this successfully, good on him. But we're here to evaluate what these guys were able to accomplish in one run as lightweight champion, and they each have one to their name. Each are very illustrious, so we're going to talk about who is greater between the two today. Hey, I don't know if you noticed either, but that's not Khabib, that's Nurilo Aliyev. So we're going to talk about Khabib's legacy first, the glorious 29-0. People are really critical of Khabib for the quality of his opponents before getting the opportunity to fight for the belt, but they act like he was the only fighter in this organization's history who was allowed to cherry pick all of his fights as a contender until he was next for a title shot. Like the UFC would have let him do that. Like, it was his fault that he was not getting maybe the hardest fights at certain points of his career. But if you put all of his wins into context, they were great wins over, at the time, high-ranked opponents in lightweight. He had been fighting with the best 155ers in the promotion at the time. And the fact that lightweight didn't have the same level of depth that it does in modern MMA isn't his fault, and is not something that we should hold against him. Gleison Tibau, Michael Johnson, Rafael dos Anjos, and Edson Barbosa were as good of contender fights as you were able to get at lightweight during this time, like the mid-2010s. The UFC was matchmaking him so he wasn't able to stat pad like people claim, and they still want to say, oh yeah, this guy was just taking easy fights and pulling out of hard ones. Even though he pulled out of 5 of them, the opponents were Donald Cerrone 2 times and Tony Ferguson 3 times. So don't go with these narratives without doing the research, bro. People want to say Khabib is like a pullout merchant. He wasn't ducking either of these fights. It's not a matter of being afraid to fight these fighters. It's just not wanting to take these fights whenever he's not healthy. And it's a smart thing for him to have done with the goal of retiring undefeated. Khabib mowed down every single contender that they put in front of him, and when people critique the fact that he wasn't supremely dominant in finishing every fight in round 1, he was still never cut and he never bled. He looked perfect as a contender. For all the people who hate on Khabib for having won his belt off of Raging Al, like he chose this, they haven't even seen the fight. Because it did go to decision, 5 rounds, but Khabib looked like a K1 kickboxer, and he obliterated the real estate agent in this fight. People have never seen this fight try to downplay the accomplishment of Khabib winning the title by implying that because he fought with the guy who isn't champion level and was a short notice replacement, that Khabib didn't perform well because the fight went to decision. But he beat this guy to death. You need to go rewatch the fight if that's what you think. Nurmagomedov also has what may be the best 3 defenses from any champion in this weight class, and that's just because they're time specific. 2018 Conor McGregor is a very good win. 2019 Dustin Poirier is a very good win. 2020 Gaethje, this is like 2017 Ben Simmons, or whenever he was a rookie in the league. 2020 Gaethje was the boogeyman of the entire division. After he beat up Tony Ferguson, this was the fight he took directly afterwards, and everyone was thinking, oh my god, this might be it. We got word that it was Khabib's retirement fight, and me, because I was new to the sport and hadn't seen Khabib compete live and only had seen Justin Gaethje of the 2 fighters recently beat up Tony Ferguson, because I did make it for that, I was like, dude, Justin Gaethje might actually knock out Khabib, and he ran through him. The contenders that Khabib was beating for the belts that he was defending at the time were the best 155ers. And whenever I first got into the sport, it was so hard for me to imagine any of the fighters who are active in lightweight doing anything to set themselves apart from the grinder that I knew that division was. I thought they were all about neck and neck with each other, and Khabib was just a level above. But I didn't know that to begin with. I had to learn by watching. Khabib was the first person to show the world that as far as MMA goes and combat sports in general, sure, he wasn't a very focused or locked in Conor McGregor in that fight, and that was the start of his decline before he even stepped in the cage. He showed the world that McGregor was a lot of hype, and aside from not being the best boxer for his weight class as Mayweather had shown him, Khabib made it so that people were beginning to acknowledge that Conor isn't even running things in MMA anymore. And Khabib is the only person to ever drop Conor McGregor without knocking him out. Dustin Poirier got another drop on Conor McGregor, but he ended up finishing the fight, which is sweeter, but another part of me does think that this might have been a better victory, for sure, than what Dustin Poirier was able to score over Conor in their second fight. Because not only did Khabib choke out Conor McGregor with that face crank. He didn't even choke him. He just squeezed his jaw until he felt like his head was going to explode and he tapped. And Conor McGregor was the striker in MMA. And so he has to live with that, knowing that his butt hit the canvas because Khabib timed a perfect overhand and he chased him to the cage and got grappled immediately afterwards. And sure, he did pretty good in that fight, Conor McGregor, whenever you do compare his performances to other people's that Khabib fought before he retired. But this was a statement. And the brawl afterwards, Khabib's reign was so lit, and that goes right into his perfect retirement. I was talking about how he handled the Gaethje fight. I know I've written this into like the PowerPoint, but I actually was afraid for Khabib going into the Gaethje fight. I'll be on record in saying that, but now having known what I know and seeing that afterwards, if he were to have challenged Charles or whoever, I wouldn't have been afraid for him. And with full confidence, I would assume that he would win whatever fight he had taken, and he might have taken virtually no damage. The most damage that Khabib ever took in fights were against Michael Johnson and Gleison Tibau. They were very early on in his career as well. As fights became more dangerous, it seemed like Khabib was able to keep himself safer and take less damage and win the fights more easily every single time. Khabib is like Dricus in the sense that his striking and striking defense looks hideous, but it's very effective. I was watching some of Khabib's fights earlier to refresh, and Khabib is such an illusion because of how unassuming his speed and power is. Or was, I guess. And how fighters felt like other parts of his game deserved more notice and respect than his striking did. And that was their great mistake, because he actually did outstrike Dustin Poirier in that fight. And Dustin Poirier at that time was considered probably the best boxer in the UFC at 2019. Peter Yan was just then establishing himself as that, and he didn't really even start to do work to cement that until later on, and JDM wasn't even around at this point, so it was actually just Dustin Poirier, and Khabib outstruck him. Flawless wins over Conor and Dustin, who did no damage to him, and this was followed by a retirement fight against Gooch, Justin Gaethje. Khabib mogged Justin, he took his best shots to the chin, and he secured the takedowns. He was fighting like this was his last fight, and that he didn't care about preserving himself. This was the most risk that I've ever seen Khabib put himself in. He did not defend any of the hooks or leg kicks and was eating hard shots off of Gaethje. Right on the chin, right on the calves, walking right into range to eat more of these shots, going in for the hips, getting the takedowns. He secured mount, took an arm, and then realized that Justin Gaethje wouldn't tap, so he'd end up having to snap his arm, and his parents were there. So in the next round, because the fight made it into the second, the first round was ended with Khabib about to fold Justin Gaethje's arm under his hip. And so he was like, no, let me chill on that. So he goes out, gets mount again, and gets really heavy on Gaethje, and then throws up a triangle. It's not even just like a risky triangle either. It was almost like he paid Justin Gaethje to get inside of it. I know it's nothing like that, but it was so easy for him to do, and the fight was over. And at the end of it, he had only landed 3 fewer significant strikes. It was 26-29. Khabib's legacy is mercy killing Justin Gaethje in front of his parents, breaking down in the cage over missing his dad, vowing to never fight again because of a promise that he made to his mom. Islam had been an active fighter up to the point of Khabib retiring, so immediately he set his sights on building up Makhachev to pick up things where he left them off. Retired with nothing to prove, it was very smart for him to hop on this Islam train to become his trainer and coach. This also makes people realize how simply he would have won certain fights that he didn't stick around for, since Islam is so similar to him stylistically. The biggest fights that Khabib left on the table were with Tony Ferguson and GSP. Charles Oliveira wasn't even like a factor in any of this yet, so we can't say that Oliveira was the biggest fight for him because that wasn't even anything that was happening or relevant. The fight with Tony was scheduled so many different times and it fell through. Abdulmanap, who is Khabib's dad, always dreamed of Khabib fighting GSP. Ferguson losing all the times post-Khabib retirement proved that this fight would have been a massacre. Tony Ferguson had no business ever being in the cage with Khabib, and we didn't need to see that fight happen in order for that to be proven. I'm pretty comfortable in just saying that now. I feel like everyone kind of agrees if you know ball. And GSP hasn't fought once since Khabib left the UFC, so that fight just wasn't meant to happen, and I'm okay with that too. So 29-0, never cut, never bled, set the record for 3 defenses, notched in the most competitive weight class at the time and possibly still. Khabib was a special fighter, and I'm not really saying anything. He was not far behind in his striking to his grappling. And whenever I say that, people are going to be like, huh? Because they're just going to see all the clips that get reposted of whenever he was just a whelp and still developing as a fighter. At the very end of his career, his striking wasn't that far off from his grappling. And the way that they both worked together with the threat of the takedown, making it so that he could basically land whatever boxing combinations that he wanted, and his hands were pretty sharp and he had a good jab, Khabib's striking was very good. And it wasn't that much worse than his wrestling. I need people to understand this, dude. And I think it's really ridiculous that most of the people who hate on Khabib are new fans who got into the sport around the same time that I did or later on. And they only had the opportunity, if they did get into the sport around the same time that I did, to see Khabib perform at his height whenever he actually was what people claim to be a Mount Rushmore great of the sport. And they still choose to repost the clips of him whenever he was still green. I don't know why the rhetoric against Khabib is so strong, because he was a good ambassador for the sport and a great champion. Next, we'll talk about the big shoes that he left behind for Islam to fill. Replace Khabib would have been an impossible task for basically anyone else. Islam is kind of the same fighter as Khabib, except he takes more risk and is more versatile as a striker with better kicks and more fast twitch explosiveness. Khabib has pretty solid power, but Islam is weirdly significantly more powerful than Khabib. But relatively speaking, I would say that Islam's striking defense is substantially worse than Khabib's, and Khabib is able to mitigate a lot more damage by avoiding risk through IQ and also with his head movement and guard than Islam is able to, especially whenever he's boxing with people. In the 2 years that he took to wait before beginning his title run between 2019 and 2021, he developed at a scary rate, Islam Makhachev, and went from a guy who leaves exposed openings, super exposed openings at least, to get knocked out, to a guy who drowns and completely controls like his cousin, or more like his cousin at least. That Pantoja knockout will always haunt his record no matter how successful he becomes. He definitely would have been better off had it not happened, and it definitely hurts his comparison to Khabib. I always make the joke that Pantoja knocked him out. The fighter's name is actually Adriano Martins. He just looks like Pantoja, and that's why everyone makes that joke. If you're new here, you're caught up now. Arman, Drew Dober, Thiago Moises, King Green, Dan Hooker, these are all quality wins, and Islam spent his contendership making these established combatants all look like free trial guys. And there's much name value in this rise through the ranks, especially as time progresses too. Certain fighters like Drew Dober maybe have tapered off throughout certain points of their career, but Thiago Moises is still around. Arman Sarukian is the number one contender of this division. King Green has been around, and Dan Hooker, who's currently number 4 ranked in the division right now. So you can't slight the contenders that he's beaten to become the champion. People want to say that he's beaten no one to deserve a belt, but this just isn't true. Islam slayed the top 15, and the UFC hopped on the first opportunity to make Makhachev versus Oliveira since Khabib versus Ferguson had gotten away so many times, and this fight was like the modern version of that one. We end up getting the fight. It happens in Abu Dhabi. Islam does have home court advantage. Oliveira at this point is a fan favorite. He's more liked than Islam, so he still feels the love online, I guess. All the people in attendance were Muslim guys wearing robes, so they were definitely rooting for Islam. Never once have I seen a fight with hype like this one end with more anticlimax. Islam displayed that he was a dynamic striker several fights before this. The biggest development that Islam made throughout his career and improving towards becoming the champion was in his power output. He's very powerful, and this fight made me understand this because he showed shades of being able to knock people out against Tebow as he fought in 2018. 5 more years would be required for Islam to score another walk-off knockout, and that would be against Alexander Volkanovski, but this fight was also very important as far as displaying Islam's power win. He hadn't really displayed much as a striker going into this fight, because leading to the belt, he was playing very safe like Khabib. He was heavy in grappling people to direct himself towards getting submissions over them, and he was taking very little risk in these fights just so he can secure these rankings and get to the belt. But whenever he fought Charles Oliveira, he was like, okay, let me strike with this dude. And he did wrestle throughout the first round, but he did try to stand up a lot, and he rarely got touched, and he was dumping a nice jab off on Charles, hitting him with this cross too. Nice tricky southpaw boxing. Islam is a very good fighter too. I know I just glazed Khabib for a considerable amount of time, but this was a good showing. I think that as a kickboxer, Islam is better than Khabib, but he has worse defense. He grapples like Khabib, but he leaves more space and has overall less control with the same style. So he does basically everything that Khabib does at a less rate of proficiency, but it's hardly noticeable. But he's also more fluid in his striking, especially whenever we're discussing kickboxing. Specifically, kickboxing is where he sets himself apart from Khabib. Post the Eagle leaving, fans would debate whether or not Conor, Dustin, and Gaethje, or Chandler, Dustin, and Gaethje were better defenses. Charles lost his belt and his second defense on the scales. People would debate whether or not Charles was a better champion than Khabib because Charles was very popular with the fans. This was never really a debate, man, but this is what that clout will really do to MFs, man. It's crazy. But people still viewed this as a title defense for him because he did win so emphatically. But this was a vacant belt after this fight. His win over Gaethje was comparable to Khabib's. I don't think it was better than his, but that made people compare their legacies as champions in this division. And so because of this ongoing debate, Islam bored a hole through Charles Oliveira's head with a check hook that he unleashed in the second round of this fight after he had sunned him on the ground just by stacking his full guard the entire first round. And then he comes out in the second. Charles Oliveira whiffs a big flying knee, eats a big hook and goes down and lays on his back and does that like retreat and like rest and recover thing where he just posts both of his hands behind his head and then just tries to suck air until he can get back into the fight. Islam is like, no, dude, what are you doing? And he moves Charles Oliveira's legs to the side and he gets into side control and he can pass super easily because Charles is very hurt. And he wraps up a arm triangle and it gets finished. And Charles Oliveira does actually a good job of trying to roll out of it. But he's stuck because Islam Makhachev is freakishly strong. So what ended up happening over time is that all the skepticism just kind of turned into glaze. Some people gave Islam his fair piece that he deserved for winning this fight. Because for all the times that Charles Oliveira has been dropped, he stayed safe and he got back into the fight and won it. Islam did not allow that to happen and show that he is the supremely powerful fighter in this division. But many people still wanted to hate, and they supported Volkanovski the first time that he challenged to become champ by beating Makhachev in Australia. He wanted to do that. So Islam, a huge part of his process whenever he cuts weight is that he makes weight and then he rehydrates with an IV. And in Australia, their commissions don't sanction that. So he wasn't allowed to use the IV. He gets down to the weight. He now has to go through an entirely different process for rehydration that he's never undergone before. So he doesn't really look as full and as muscular as he does in other nights. He actually looked kind of shrunken in this first fight against Volk. And so the first match was relatively close. And that made it so that bitter Charles fans started rooting for Volkanovski to win in the second fight whenever they would rematch. They were in Abu Dhabi. Islam lands a beautiful high kick to stop this fight with a sequence that makes it look like he's actually related to Zabit and not Khabib. All the bad weather fans who leapt from Charles to Volk, they just started to become Islam fans in troves because casuals, man, they only do what's trendy. And that's one thing that I've noticed a lot about this fan base. And if the gladiator arenas were the same way, then I feel actually a lot of sympathy for these fighters. Islam has proper glazers now, and he always has from the Muslim community. People who hate on Islam are upset for the fact that a fighter who they don't like for their own reasons, whatever they may be, beats their favorite fighter. And it's just contrarian. People just want to be different. So they disrespect the accomplishments of Islam so that they think that they look more like hardcore fans. For some reason, it seems like some type of hardcore thing to do. In order to prove that you're not a casual, you hate on Khabib and you hate on Islam and you hate on the Dagestanis. But it's actually just common sense to give them credit for their work because it's great and they've produced a lot of good moments for the sport. And if you look at all these moments in a microcosm and remove your personal biases from them, even though that is another layer of the sport that makes it fun, you'll be able to appreciate beautiful knockouts and beautiful submissions and great performances that led up to these moments. The only leg that his critics really have to stand on is that he had closer fights than Khabib did with other people and was knocked out. To say that he was nearly finished at any point after he was knocked out by Pantoja is a stretch, but he's taken some damage in his fights, and he also got dropped against Volk, and he slipped against Renato Moicano. And my heart sunk into my toes whenever I was watching that fight live, and I saw Islam Makhachev slip after that hook hit his armpit. I thought he had been glassed and that we were about to watch a belt get wrapped around Money Moicano. I was about to throw up. So now we'll begin direct comparison. Arman boned Islam's legacy past setting the record for defenses at this weight class by forcing the record defense to be won over a journeyman. That Renato Moicano win was significant only because it was the fourth title defense for Islam, and that had never been done before. Aside from this, that was such an easy fight for him to win that it didn't really matter. A lot of us probably have forgotten about it by this point. The fact that Khabib was more of a pressuring wrestler helped to keep him safe since he took very little risks with the timing, finishing, and control on his takedowns and then grappling then afterwards. Khabib didn't fight people, he really just broke them down. Islam does the same thing, but he lacks the ability to take all of the wind out of fighters' sails before they can get going themselves. Khabib, never having lost, comes down to the fact that his style was a lot more reserved than Islam Makhachev's was, and it was focused on expending energy in positions of minimal self-risk and keeping himself safe. Volk and Charles both got KO'd by Islam, but Islam took the risk of striking at range with both fighters before scoring the highlights. He clearly had no intent on grappling in the second Volk fight, and I think that after the first round had passed, he definitely wasn't trying to do any more wrestling with Charles either before he knocked his ass down. So Islam is about 85% of the wrestler that Khabib is after I'm reviewing the footage of both of them. Khabib seems heavier on his opponents on the ground than Islam Makhachev. Makhachev allows his opponents more opportunities to escape or reverse positions while he advances or attacks submissions. Khabib has Al Iaquinta, Conor McGregor, Dustin Poirier, and Justin Gaethje on his title resume. Al for the belt, and then 3 defenses. Islam Makhachev has Charles Oliveira for the belt, Alexander Volkanovski 2 times with 1 flatline KO, Dustin Poirier, and Renato Moicano. So, I mean, side by side, Charles Oliveira and then 2 wins over Alexander Volkanovski. Alexander Volkanovski is a UFC great, guaranteed Hall of Famer in the future. Charles Oliveira has beaten 2 of the 4 fighters on Khabib's title resume, and they have a shared win over Dustin Poirier, plus Renato Moicano just for fun. And even though we're talking about this illustrious resume on Islam Makhachev, you cannot find a photo of Khabib online with a bloody face. And that counts for a lot for me whenever I'm talking about who was greater. Never cut, never bled. Like, that means a lot to me. So my final verdict is going to be Khabib is the better fighter, who displayed more dominance and never lost. Islam is less skilled, but the difference is so minute that it really doesn't matter at all. Islam has a better record on paper, but he controls every situation a little bit worse than Khabib. Islam can accomplish all the things that Khabib could, but he just looks, again, a little bit worse while doing it. So I would say that if Khabib is a 10, then Islam is a 9.7. So on the footage, you see a little bit of a difference. You barely notice it on the footage. But to their opponents, they might as well be fighting the same guy. And that's case in point with the Dustin Poirier fight. Khabib came out and he broke Dustin Poirier in 2 rounds and some change. Dustin Poirier was a less experienced grappler at this time, but he laid the framework for then all the other striker-grappler hybrids to come up afterwards and beat Dustin Poirier. The way he did it was spectacular, and he took no damage. Islam Makhachev had a war with Dustin Poirier, but in the very end, they both achieved the same result. Islam Makhachev's fight with Dustin Poirier was just Khabib's fight with Dustin Poirier with a few extra steps. So Islam Makhachev is just Khabib with a few extra steps. And that extra step is willingness to engage in kickboxing and more potency as a kickboxer, and generally more power. If you do want to pick a winner between the two, the final point that I'm going to make is that Khabib is better than Islam, because if we're talking about legacy, Islam is part of Khabib's legacy because they both shared in learning from Khabib's father. Khabib is a direct descendant from his father and has mastered the arts in his place, and then instructed Islam on how to win fights in the division that he was champion in. That's maybe one of the highest honors awarded to any athlete in this sport, is to have a great undefeated career and to have another generational talent become part of your legacy because you directly were involved in his success. So that's what I think. Both are great champions. We should respect them equally. I wonder what Ilia Topuria is going to achieve as lightweight champion whenever he becomes one at International Fight Week. If you stuck around to this point in the video, please like, comment, and subscribe. I had a great day today. I hope you guys did too. I will catch you fellas in the next one.